In 1270, a map appeared in Pisa that nobody in the city could have made. What it contained would dismantle everything anyone thought they knew about what was possible, and the man who signed it in 1339 had no idea what he was holding. Delsert inherited it, from where he didn't know. He spent his career working with something he hadn't produced, adding coastlines at the margins, refining the conventions, passing forward something whose origin he couldn't see and never questioned. He drew the windroses and marked the harbors and put his name on it and moved on. The accuracy underneath his work didn't come from him, it came from somewhere he had no access to and couldn't have named. These were nautical maps of the Mediterranean and Black Sea, crisscrossed with compass lines radiating from windroses, coastlines rendered with a detail that knew exactly where the harbors opened and where the capes pushed into the sea. Sailors used them on the most traveled waters in the medieval world. They worked. Modern GPS surveys confirm the correspondence between the Portugal coastlines, and reality is not approximate, it is exact. To produce that exactness requires mathematics that nobody in Europe would possess for another 5 centuries. The problem of measuring east-west position across a map longitude was not solved until the 18th century. Whatever made these charts solved it in 1270, as if the answer had already existed somewhere before them, and the people who drew the charts had simply received it without knowing what they were receiving or where it came from. The oldest surviving Portugal chart, the Carta Pisana, appearing in Pisa around 1270, is already sophisticated, already exact, already displaying the conventions that would persist unchanged for 3 centuries of chart-making that followed. There are no earlier versions showing a tradition developing toward this. No experimental drafts, no primitive precursors. It arrived fully formed, which means whoever made it was not inventing. They were also copying sailor knowledge accumulated over generations of practical navigation, Arabic cartographic traditions moving through Mediterranean trade networks, Greek surveying methods preserved through Byzantine intermediaries and passed into the Majorcan school. These are not unreasonable proposals, they are the best available. When the geodetic data is examined against each of them, they account for the general shape of the known coastlines, for the harbor locations, for the broad correspondence with reality. None of them account for the accuracy. The chart makers who signed their work, Delsert, Vescont, Pizzagano, were skilled craftsmen who improved at the margins, added new coastlines as exploration extended the known world, refined the conventions that made the charts readable to navigators who staked their lives on them. But the core accuracy, the Mediterranean geometry that matches Mercator, was already there when the tradition began. They didn't produce it, they received it. They worked with it without understanding what they had inherited, and when they died, they passed it forward. The chain runs from Delsert back to Vescont, back to the Carta Pisana, and then into silence. Nobody in the chain made it, which means whoever made the Carta Pisana was also copying. The tradition didn't begin in 1270. It arrived in 1270 carrying something older, something that required systematic surveying using tools that no civilization before the Renaissance left any record of possessing, something that existed somewhere before the archive begins, produced its results, and vanished without leaving any other trace than the accuracy it passed forward through every generation that came after it. That vanishing goes back further than the archive, further than the first written record of any civilization that might have produced it, further than anything we can name or trace or find in any collection anywhere. Whoever first looked at the Mediterranean and found a way to record it with a precision the world would not independently reach for another 5 centuries is completely invisible to us. We can only see the echo of their work, degraded and copied and carried forward across generations that did not understand what they were carrying, arriving finally in the hand of a cartographer in Majorca in 1339 who put his name on it and moved on. Their measurements are in a museum. The only evidence they ever existed is the accuracy inside his map. We will never know who they were. We will never know when they worked. The map is in a glass case. The people who made what's inside it are nowhere. Number 9. In 1502, an Italian spy bribed an anonymous Portuguese cartographer to copy a map that should never have left Lisbon, and what that copy showed placed Florida on the map of the known world 11 years before anyone officially discovered it. Alberto Contino was in Lisbon buying horses for the Duke of Ferrara. That was his cover. His actual mission was to extract Portugal's most closely guarded strategic asset, the royal standard, the master map of every voyage Portugal had conducted and every coastline its ships had found, and its government had refused to share with any foreign power. Portugal had spent nearly a century systematically exploring the world's coastlines, and the knowledge accumulated from each returning expedition was worth more strategically than any fleet. The Royal Standard was updated with every voyage. It was classified at the highest level. It was never published and never shared. Cantino paid 12 gold ducats to a cartographer whose name he never recorded, whose face he may not have remembered within a year. That man copied 6 sheets of parchment onto which he transferred the classified knowledge of a century of Portuguese exploration. Cantino smuggled them to Italy in 1502. Those 6 sheets changed the world. They showed Africa's coastline with a precision built over a century of systematic exploration. They showed the Caribbean with a detail that exceeded what the documented voyage record should allow. They showed Brazil extending further south than the single brief 1500 landfall could have produced. And they showed Florida, the peninsula, in its correct position and shape, 11 years before Ponce de Leon would claim its official discovery, and 2 years before Columbus died, still believing he had reached Asia. The explanation is reasonable. Portugal had both the capability and the motivation to conduct voyages to North America before 1502 and suppress any record of them. The Corte Real brothers had been exploring the North Atlantic in 1500 and 1501, undocumented voyages reaching further south, incorporated into the Royal Standard without public attribution. This is consistent with how Portugal operated. The classified original would explain Florida. It would explain everything. The classified original doesn't exist. It was presumably in Lisbon when the earthquake struck in 1755 and destroyed the city's archives. Only the spy's copy survives. And the spy's copy barely survived. It reached Ferrara, sat in a ducal library for 90 years, moved to Modena when the Ferrara collections were transferred, was lost when the palace was ransacked in 1859, and that same year the director of the Biblioteca Estense found it in a butcher's shop in the city, being used as a wall partition in a meat market. The only surviving record of what Portugal knew about the New World in 1502 was hanging in a slaughterhouse. The Cantino planisphere was copied by Niccolò de Caveri shortly after it arrived in Italy. That copy became Waldseemüller's primary source for the 1507 map that named America. The chain of cartographic transmission that produced the name America runs through a map that was stolen from Portugal, smuggled in a diplomatic bag, rescued from a butcher's wall, and whose original was destroyed in an earthquake. Without the spy's bribe, there is no Cantino planisphere. Without the Cantino planisphere, there is no Canario map. Without the Canario map, there is no Waldseemüller 1507. Without the Waldseemüller, there is no name America. The political identity of 2 continents traces back through a chain of theft and survival to a bribe paid to a cartographer who was never named. The cartographer who made the Cantino planisphere is unknown. Cantino never recorded his name. The man who copied the classified knowledge of a century of Portuguese exploration onto 6 sheets of parchment, the man whose anonymous work became the foundation on which the Western Hemisphere was named, and whose copy was found in a butcher's shop, has no name in any historical record. The map exists, the maker doesn't. The knowledge survived, the person who transmitted it did not. How the Royal Standard knew about Florida in 1502 has not been explained. What voyage produced that knowledge? Whose ship first saw that coastline? Whose names belong to that discovery? None of it is recoverable. The original that would answer those questions is gone. The spy's copy that survives shows Florida. The voyage that put it there has vanished from the record entirely. Number 8. In 1507, a German cartographer working in a small town in northeastern France produced a map that named a continent nobody had officially confirmed existed, showed an ocean no European had officially seen, and accurately depicted that ocean's width 6 years before any European stood on its eastern shore. Martin Waldseemüller's Universalis Cosmographia is the first map to call the New World America. It is also the first map to show the Americas as a distinct landmass clearly separated from Asia by a large ocean. Balboa would not see the Pacific from its eastern shore until 1513. Magellan would not cross it until 1520. In 1507, no European is documented as knowing the Pacific existed as a distinct body of water separate from the Atlantic. Waldseemüller showed it anyway, correctly proportioned, correctly placed, separating the new continent from Asia with a width he approximated with startling accuracy. The map was made at a small scholarly workshop in Saint-Dié-de-Vosges by a group of humanist scholars working from Vespucci's published accounts and from cartographic data that had recently arrived through Portuguese channels. From those assembled sources, Waldseemüller produced something that went beyond any of them. Originally printed in an edition of 1,000 copies, one survives. The Library of Congress purchased it in '23 for $10 million, the most expensive map ever bought. It had been sitting in a German castle, unstudied, for 4 centuries, before being found in 1901. Of the 1,000 copies originally printed, the other 999 have been gone for 5 centuries. Whatever annotations, corrections, source references, or additional knowledge those copies carried went with them. The accepted explanation is that Waldseemüller extrapolated the Pacific from Ptolemy's classical geographic model. Ancient Greek geography implied a water gap between the known landmass and Asia, and Waldseemüller extended it into a distinct ocean, a reasonable deduction from available classical sources. The gap he drew was larger and more accurately proportioned than Ptolemy's model would predict. The Pacific appears on this map as if from a source that knew it existed, with real dimensions, real proportions, correct placement relative to the continents on both sides. That source has never been identified in Waldseemüller's documented materials. Waldseemüller himself lost confidence in his own map. In 1513, he produced a revised world map that returned America to Asia, removed the name America, and labeled the new continent Terra Incognita. He walked back the most consequential cartographic statement of his career. Whatever source had led him to show a separate continent separated from Asia by a vast and correctly proportioned ocean, he appears to have concluded it was not reliable enough to stand behind. The name had already spread beyond recall. The man who named 2 continents spent his final years trying to take the name back. He failed. The name America comes from this map. If the one surviving copy had been lost in the German castle where it sat unstudied for 4 centuries, the naming of the Western Hemisphere would be attributed to a later cartographer working from a different chain of sources. The political and cultural identity of 2 continents traces back to one piece of paper that survived by accident in a castle for 400 years. One copy out of 1,000. Whatever the other 999 copies carried, whatever annotations, corrections, or additional source references the scholars at Saint-Dié included with those additions, went with them into 5 centuries of silence. We know what the one surviving copy shows. We have no idea what the 999 lost copies might have clarified about where the Pacific came from, or what source Waldseemüller was drawing on when he placed it there. The Pacific on the surviving copy, drawn from a source that has never been identified, correctly proportioned in a way that Ptolemy's model doesn't fully explain, by a man who later tried to retract it, is still there, showing an ocean nobody in 1507 was supposed to know existed. The man who drew it tried to say it wasn't real. The ocean remained. The name he tried to take back remained. One copy survived, and whatever was in the source that told him the Pacific was there, in the dimensions he drew it, has never been found. Number 7. In 1957, a map appeared claiming to show North America as a Viking discovery predating Columbus by nearly 5 centuries. Yale University authenticated it and announced it to the world in 1965 as one of the most significant cartographic discoveries of the century. It was a forgery, and the way the forgery was made changes the story of what was lost. The map purports to be a 15th century Mappa Mundi showing a landmass southwest of Greenland labeled Vinlanda Insula. When Yale announced it, the revelation made the front page of the New York Times. Harvard, the Smithsonian, and Yale's own scholars divided over its authenticity for decades. Tests were conducted, results disputed. Experts testified on both sides. Then comprehensive chemical analysis confirmed that the ink contained anatase, a form of titanium dioxide not commercially produced before the 1920s. The map was a 20th century fabrication, but it had been drawn on genuine medieval parchment, carbon dated to approximately 1434. Yale's analysis determined the forger had taken those pages from another medieval manuscript already in the Beinecke Library, the Speculum Historiale of Vincent of Beauvais, a genuine 15th century document. An inscription on the back, originally a binder's note in authentic iron gall ink, had been overwritten in the modern titanium-containing ink to change its meaning. The forger destroyed a genuine medieval document to create a false one. Something that had survived since the 15th century was erased in the act of inventing something false. The Norse were in North America. L'Anse aux Meadows in Newfoundland, confirmed by archaeologists in 1960, 3 years before the Vinland map was publicly announced. is a genuine Norse settlement from approximately 1000 CE, with timber buildings, a forge, and workshops for ship repair. The sagas describe multiple settlements, suggesting a presence more extensive than one site in Newfoundland. The forger was not inventing Norse America. Norse America was real. The forger was manufacturing cartographic evidence for a historical fact that had no cartographic evidence. The Vinland map generated more public awareness of Norse exploration of North America than the actual archaeological evidence at Lanzos Meadows. A fake map did more to establish a historical reality than a genuine excavated site. The lie traveled further than the truth. And the forger, whose identity has never been definitively established, whose motivation remains unknown, who destroyed a real medieval document in the process, appears to have understood something the historical record acknowledged only reluctantly. The absence of cartographic evidence for Norse America was a genuine gap. The Norse were there. They explored coastlines, they built settlements, they had contact with indigenous populations across what is now Canada and possibly New England. The sagas describe 3 separate lands, Helluland, Markland, Vinland, each with specific geographic features, each visited on multiple occasions. If any of them ever drew a map of what they found, if any Norse cartographer or sailor or monk ever recorded the shape of those coastlines on parchment, if any chart was ever made of the waters they sailed between Greenland and North America, nothing from that tradition has survived. The void the Vinland map was designed to fill is still there. The forger filled it with something false that pointed towards something true. The false thing has been exposed. The true thing remains cartographically undocumented. The Norse reached North America around 1000 CE. They were there for decades. They returned multiple times across generations, and they left no map. The real Norse cartographic knowledge of North America, if it was ever committed to parchment, if any chain of transmission ever existed for it, is gone. The Vinland map is in Yale's collection, identified as a forgery, still studied, now more for what it tells us about 20th century motivations and forgery techniques than about 15th century cartography. It remains an interesting historical object not for what it shows but for what it tried to show and why. The real Norse cartographic knowledge of North America, if it was ever committed to any form of record, if any chain of transmission ever carried it forward from the 10th century to the present, is gone. The fake is in a glass case. The real map, if it ever existed, is nowhere. Number 6. In 1559, an Ottoman cartographer in Constantinople drew a map of the world that showed a land bridge connecting Siberia to Alaska. That land bridge had been underwater for approximately 10,000 years. The Bering Land Bridge was submerged at the end of the last ice age roughly 10 to 11,000 years ago, when rising seas flooded the connection between Asia and North America. It has been underwater ever since. Western science would not theorize its existence until the 18th century. Vitus Bering would not cross the strait it left behind until 1728. No mapmaker in 1559 had any documented knowledge that such a connection had ever existed. The Haji Ahmed world map shows it. Not as a vague northern landmass, but as a specific geographic connection between Asia and America at the correct latitude, with the correct coastal shapes on both sides, in a map that demonstrates high accuracy in multiple other regions. The standard explanation is coincidence, a vague northern connection that happens to resemble actual geography by chance, or a misinterpretation of Russian or Chinese accounts about the northern frontier, or an artifact of the map projection creating an apparent connection where none was intended. These are the available explanations and they have been applied seriously. The connection appears at the correct latitude. The Siberian and Alaskan coastline shapes match the actual geography of the Bering region. In a map that shows other areas with demonstrable accuracy, coincidence at that level of specificity in a geographically meaningful feature is not an explanation. It is an admission that no explanation has been found. Haji Ahmed was a compiler, not a surveyor. He assembled his world map from older source charts, previous maps, traveler accounts, naval records accumulated over generations of cartographic tradition. The Bering land bridge detail did not come from a contemporary survey. It came from somewhere in the chain behind him, from something old enough to have known that connection when it still existed, when the land was above water, when the bridge that carried humanity from Asia into the Americas was still walkable. That record somehow survived 10,000 years of copying and degradation and transmission across languages and civilizations and cartographic traditions, carried forward through generations of mapmakers who drew it without understanding what it represented, until it appeared in a 16th century Ottoman world map as a detail whose significance nobody who drew it grasped. The Bering Land Bridge is how the Americas were populated. Every human being who lived in North or South America before European contact descended from people who crossed it between roughly 30,000 and 10,000 years ago. It is the most consequential geographic feature in human prehistory, the path by which half the world's landmass was reached by our species. The people who crossed it didn't know they were crossing between continents. They were following game. They were doing what their ancestors had always done, and they populated 2 continents in the process. And then the water rose and the bridge went under and it was gone. 10,000 years later, it appears on a map made in Constantinople, correctly placed, correctly shaped, in a document compiled by a cartographer who had no contemporary source for it and no documented awareness of what he was including. Something in the chain behind Haji Ahmed preserved a record of a world that ceased to exist before any civilization we know of had developed writing. We do not know what that something was or how old it was when it entered the chain of copying. We do not know what else it might have contained, what other geographic knowledge of the pre-Ice Age world traveled alongside the Bering detail through the generations of cartographers who passed it forward without understanding it. We know only that this detail reached Constantinople in 1559 and was copied into a world map by a cartographer passing forward something he didn't understand. The bridge told us how humanity reached the Americas. A map made 10,000 years after it disappeared told us it had existed. We still don't know how the map knew. Number 5. In 1450, a Venetian monk who had never left his island drew a ship rounding the southern tip of Africa. Bartholomew Dias would not actually sail around that tip for another 38 years. Fra Mauro lived in a Camaldolese monastery on the island of Murano, in the Venetian lagoon. He never left. For years he interviewed travelers who passed through Venice, merchants, sailors, pilgrims, diplomats returning from distant courts, consulted manuscripts, cross-referenced accounts from across the known world, and compiled everything he could find into the largest and most detailed medieval world map ever produced. The map measured roughly 2 meters in diameter. King Afonso V of Portugal commissioned it to answer one specific question: does a sea route to India exist around Africa's southern tip? Fra Mauro's answer was yes. He drew Africa tapering correctly to a navigable point at the south, at a time when every other European map showed the continent extending indefinitely downward with no passage through. He drew a ship rounding that point. He wrote a note describing the possibility of the passage. The map also showed Japan with geographic detail suggesting sources beyond Marco Polo's accounts. East Africa's coastline matched Portuguese surveys that wouldn't be conducted for decades after Fra Mauro's death. The scope and accuracy of what he compiled from his island, without ever leaving it, was extraordinary. He died in 1459 without knowing if his cape was real. Dias proved him right in 1488. Da Gama followed the route Fra Mauro had drawn in 1498, sailing from Portugal around Africa's southern cape to India, along a path that a monk who never left Venice had mapped 48 years before the first ship completed it. The explanation is plausible. Venice's merchant networks were the most extensive in the medieval Mediterranean. Arab geographers had described the navigability of Africa's southern waters for centuries. Fra Mauro had access to sources unavailable to other European cartographers, travelers from further east, manuscripts in languages other cartographers couldn't read, accounts from the edges of the known world that arrived in Venice through its exceptional trade connections. No specific source for the southern cape has ever been identified. No Arab manuscript, no merchant's account, no traveler's report that matches what Fra Mauro drew with the precision he drew it has been found. He drew it correctly, not approximately, not directionally, but with enough precision to serve as the planning document for the most consequential sea voyage in European history. The map was not vague about the Cape. It was specific. It showed a ship. It showed the passage. It came with a note describing the possibility of sailing around the continent. Somebody gave Fra Mauro that specific, reliable, actionable knowledge. Somebody who had been there, or who had reliable knowledge from someone who had been there, or who had read a document from someone who had been there. Somebody knew. Somebody told somebody who eventually told Fra Mauro or appeared in a manuscript he consulted across his years of compilation. The specific link in that chain, whoever first possessed reliable knowledge that Africa had a navigable southern cape and passed it into the network of travelers and manuscripts that eventually reached Murano, has never been recovered. The map Fra Mauro made for Portugal was a copy. The original stayed in the monastery. The Portuguese copy was delivered after his death and is now lost, gone sometime in the 16th century. The map delivered to the court that funded the voyages of discovery, the one that may have directly shaped the planning of Dias and da Gama's routes, doesn't exist. The only surviving Fra Mauro is the one that never left Murano. Fra Mauro never knew if his cape was real. He drew it because something in the chain of travelers and manuscripts behind his years of compilation said it was. That something dissolved behind him. The map is in Venice, in a glass case, in the monastery where he lived and died without ever seeing the ocean he drew more accurately than anyone in his century. Number 4. In 1154, an Arab geographer completed the most accurate world map that would exist for the next 3 centuries, and because it was written in Arabic, the European explorers of the 15th century spent decades and thousands of lives navigating toward destinations that had already been mapped, using inferior charts, because the better one was in a language they couldn't read. Muhammad al-Idrisi worked for 18 years at the court of Roger II, the Norman king of Sicily, a Christian king who spoke Arabic, employed Muslim scholars, and commissioned from an Arab geographer the most complete description of the world his era could produce. Al-Idrisi interviewed thousands of travelers individually and in groups, cross-referenced their accounts against each other, applied mathematical methods to reconcile conflicting information, and drew on 4 centuries of accumulated Islamic geographic scholarship. The result was a map whose circumference calculation came within 10% of correct, whose African coastline tapered correctly toward a navigable southern point, whose Indian Ocean trade routes were accurately charted, and which remained the most accurate world map on Earth for the next 300 years. Roger II had the compilation engraved on a silver disc weighing 300 pounds. 70 regional maps accompanied it. Written in Arabic, published in Arabic in Rome in 1592, 438 years after completion. Not available in Latin until 1619. Vasco da Gama sailed to India in 1498. Dias rounded the Cape of Good Hope in 1488. Columbus crossed the Atlantic in 1492. Every one of these voyages navigated toward destinations that al-Idrisi had already described, using maps inferior to the ones sitting untranslated in manuscripts across Europe. A copy of the Tabula Rogeriana had reached Paris around 1300, 198 years before da Gama sailed. It sat in the Bibliothèque Nationale while Europe sent ships into the unknown. The knowledge was in the city. The people who needed it couldn't read it. The knowledge didn't fail to travel. 10 manuscript copies survive. They reached Paris, Istanbul, Cairo, Rome. The work was copied and preserved across the Islamic world for centuries. What failed was translation, the single step that would have moved the knowledge from Arabic into Latin. That step did not happen until 1619. By then, da Gama had been dead for 95 years. Al-Idrisi completed his map in 1154. Da Gama found what it had already mapped in 1498. The 344 years between those two dates is the cost of a language barrier, not the cost of the knowledge being lost or destroyed or hidden. The knowledge was preserved. It was copied. It was in Paris 198 years before the voyage it could have guided. The cost was simply that it was written in a language the people who most needed it couldn't access. Thousands of sailors, dozens of expeditions, decades of effort directed at finding what was already known, already charted, already described in a library in Paris 438 years away from anyone who could read it. The Portuguese crown spent 50 years and enormous resources systematically working their way down the African coast, probing further south with each voyage, searching for the tip of the continent and the passage beyond it. Al-Idrisi had described that passage in 1154. He had described the Indian Ocean that lay beyond it. He had described the trade routes across it. Da Gama found all of it in 1498. He found it at the cost of everything the finding cost, and the map that could have told him where to go had been in Paris for 198 years. The Tabula Rogeriana was published in Arabic in Rome in 1592. The first Latin edition appeared in 1619. By 1619, the sea route to India had been known for 121 years. By 1619, the Americas had been named for 112 years. By 1619, the Pacific had been crossed by Magellan for 99 years. Every discovery the map could have accelerated had already happened. The knowledge arrived after it was needed, in a century that no longer required it, translated at last into a language that had already found what it described. Number 3. In 1531, the Royal Mathematician of France produced a world map showing a large southern continent with rivers, mountains, and ice-free coastlines, and the legend on that continent, written in his own hand, described it as recently discovered. Antarctica would not be officially discovered for another 289 years. Laurence Finet was not a mystic or a speculator. He was appointed royal lecturer in mathematics by King Francis I, one of the most credentialed scientists in 16th century France, whose professional credibility was his most valuable possession. His 1531 world map was serious scholarly work, and on the continent in the position where Antarctica should be, a continent with mountain ranges, river systems, bays, and coastal indentations, he wrote in Latin, "Recently discovered but not yet completely known, not hypothetical, not theoretically probable, not a deduction from classical geographic principles, recently discovered." The map sat unstudied in the Library of Congress until Charles Hapgood found it in 1959. What stopped him was the legend. He then compared Phineas's Terra Australis to the bedrock maps of Antarctica produced by the seismic surveys of 1957–1958, the first detailed surveys of the continent's geography beneath its ice. The comparison revealed correspondences that resisted easy dismissal, the Ross Sea appearing in approximately the correct position, labeled as an open bay, mountain ranges in the Antarctic interior, river drainage patterns consistent with an ice-free continent. Specific features in approximately correct positions on a map made in 1531. The skeptical case is strong. To make the correspondence work, Hapgood had to rotate the map and adjust the scale. Terra Australis, as drawn, is considerably larger than Antarctica, and its south pole is displaced by roughly 1/600 kilometers. These adjustments substantially weaken the claim. The standard explanation is that Phineas extrapolated a large southern continent from Magellan's 1520 sighting of Tierra del Fuego, confirmation that land existed south of the known world, extended into a hypothetical continent. Tierra del Fuego is an island. Phineas drew a continent with interior geography. A brief coastal sighting of a small island at the tip of South America does not produce mountain ranges and river systems in the interior of a continent 3,000 miles away. The interior features on Terra Australis are consistent with something more detailed, something that gave Phineas enough specific information to draw not just a coastline but interior geography in specific positions. And the legend says recently discovered, or once Finet understood the difference between a deduction and a reported discovery. He was a royal mathematician whose professional reputation depended on the credibility of his claims. He understood what it meant professionally to write recently discovered, rather than probable or hypothetical on a serious scholarly map. A speculative southern continent would have been labeled differently. He had reason to know the difference and reason to be precise about it. If he was extrapolating from Magellan's sighting of Tierra del Fuego, why did he write recently discovered? If he was reporting something real, if someone had told him that a large southern land had been found, with specific interior features, with rivers and mountains, the record of that report does not exist. The chain from whatever Phineas believed had been recently found back to the original discovery is broken at every recoverable point. All that remains is the legend. The map is in the Library of Congress. The legend says recently discovered. The question has no answer. Antarctica was officially discovered in 1820 by Fabian von Bellingshausen. The continent he found was covered in ice, no rivers visible, no mountains accessible, no ice-free coastlines. The continent Phineas labeled as recently discovered in 1531 had all three. Either Phineas was wrong in a way that happens to correspond to modern bedrock surveys, or there is something in the chain behind his map that preserves knowledge of Antarctica from a time before its ice covered the geographic features he drew. We cannot determine which. The legend is the only evidence, and the legend has no explanation. Number 2. In 1558, a Venetian nobleman published a map of the North Atlantic that showed the internal topography of Greenland, its mountains, its rivers, its geography beneath the ice sheet. Modern surveys using ice-penetrating radar have confirmed that specific subglacial features of Greenland correspond to details on that map. The map was published 392 years before ice-penetrating radar existed. The interior of Greenland has been covered in ice for at least 5 million years. The same map shows Friesland, a large island in the North Atlantic that does not exist, and Estotiland, and Icaria, and Drogeo. Phantom islands, none of which have ever been found, shown with the same confidence and the same apparent geographic precision as the accurately placed subglacial Greenland topography. In 1576, Martin Frobisher sailed into the Arctic specifically to find Friesland, because it appeared on the Zeno map with enough apparent authority that experienced navigators trusted it. He reached the Canadian Arctic and reported back to England that he had found it. He was near Baffin Island. He had found nothing. The accurate knowledge and the invented geography were indistinguishable from inside the document. Both traveled together. Both sent real sailors toward real places and non-existent ones simultaneously for over a century. The map was published by Niccolo Zeno the Younger, who claimed it was based on letters and navigational charts from his ancestors who supposedly sailed the North Atlantic in the 1390s. He said he found the letters damaged in a family chest and reconstructed them. The letters are gone. Only his reconstruction survives. The map is almost certainly a fabrication. No independent record confirms any 14th century Zeno sailing the North Atlantic. The Phantom Islands are clearly invented, and the historical credibility of the entire account is weak. Most scholars accept that Niccolo the Younger created or heavily embellished both the letters and the map. But the subglacial Greenland topography remains. The interior of Greenland has been covered by ice for 25 million years. Its surface presents no information about what lies beneath. The mountains and rivers shown on the Zeno map inside Greenland are not visible from the surface, not inferable from any amount of coastal observation, not the kind of knowledge that accumulates through sailing the surrounding seas. They require either direct survey of subglacial topography, impossible without modern technology, or access to a document recording that topography from a time before the ice covered it. That time is not measured in historical units, it is measured in geological ones. A map that is almost certainly a fabrication contains, alongside its clearly invented phantom geography, accurate information about the interior of a continent frozen for millions of years. If Niccolo the Younger fabricated the entire thing, as most scholars believe, he somehow included information that no person in 1558 could have obtained, and that ice-penetrating radar confirmed only 4 centuries later. How that information entered a fabricated document has no agreed explanation. Whether it came from a genuine fragment of something very old in the family archive, whether it arrived through a chain of transmission that preserved pre-glacial geographic knowledge alongside the invented Phantom Islands, we don't know. The Phantom Islands have been discredited by 5 centuries of Arctic exploration that never found them. The Greenland features have been confirmed by 20th century technology that finally had the means to look beneath the ice. The accurate knowledge and the invented knowledge were bound together in the same document, inseparable for centuries, traveling forward together through the navigational charts of Arctic explorers who trusted both equally until the real world could finally tell them apart. The question of how a fabricated map knew what ice-penetrating radar later confirmed is still open. A forger who almost certainly invented the Phantom Islands and almost certainly embellished or fabricated the Zeno family letters somehow included, in the same document, geographic information about the interior of Greenland that required knowledge from a time before the ice covered it. Whether that information came from a genuine fragment of something very old that survived in the damaged family papers, whether it arrived through some undocumented chain of transmission that preserved pre-glacial geographic knowledge, we don't know. The map sent Frobisher searching for an island that didn't exist. The same map shows mountains and rivers under ice that have been there for millions of years. Both facts are true, neither has been fully explained. Number 1. In 1929, a scholar working through unstudied documents in Istanbul's Topkapi Palace found a piece of gazelle skin that had been sitting in the archive unexamined for an unknown number of years, and what was drawn on it has been analyzed, debated, and studied for nearly a century without being fully explained. The map was drawn and signed in 1513 by a Turkish admiral named Hagi Ahmed Muhyiddin Piri Reis, Admiral Piri. The surviving portion, roughly 1/3 of the original, shows the Atlantic coastlines of Europe, Africa, and South America alongside a southern landmass that some researchers have identified as Antarctica depicted without its ice cover, 307 years before the continent's official discovery in 1820. The map appears to use a projection system resembling the one Gerardus Mercator would develop in 1569, 56 years after Piri Reis drew his map. What makes Piri Reis different from every other map on this list is that he told us where his knowledge came from. In notes written directly on the map, he described his sources, 20 charts and maps, including 8 Ptolemaic maps, 4 Portuguese charts, 1 Arabic map, 1 chart drawn by Christopher Columbus himself, and others he described as dating to the time of Alexander the Great, approximately 330 BCE. He was not claiming original knowledge, he was explicitly claiming to be a compiler, transmitting knowledge he had received from documents, some of which were already 1,800 years old when he was working. He pointed back down the chain. He named his sources, he gave us dates, he told us the originals existed. No other mapmaker on this list did that. The scholarly consensus is skeptical about the Antarctica identification. Most historians argue the southern landmass is Terra Australis, the hypothetical southern continent that appeared on virtually every map of the period. The projection resemblance may be a mathematical artifact of combining multiple source maps with different orientations. These are serious objections from serious scholars, and they are not unreasonable. They explain what is on the map. They do not explain what Piri Reis was copying from. The source maps he described as dating to Alexander's time do not exist. None of the maps from 4th century BCE Greece have survived. We know Greek geography of that era only through Ptolemy's 2nd century CE descriptions of earlier sources. Piri Reis had access to something we don't have. He said it was old. Whatever those documents contained, whatever knowledge about southern continents and ocean widths and coastlines no documented expedition had reached, entered his 1513 compilation, and has been debated ever since without resolution. Every map on this list is downstream of a source that no longer exists. The Portolan charts lead back to a survey of the Mediterranean that required mathematics 5 centuries ahead of its time and left no other trace. The Cantino's original was destroyed in an earthquake. Fra Mauro's source for the southern cape dissolved into the chain behind him. The Haji Ahmed's bearing detail came from something 10,000 years old. The Zeno map's subglacial Greenland topography came from a time before the ice covered it. The Waltzi Muller's Pacific appeared from a source that has never been identified. The Oronteus Phineus pointed back to a recently discovered continent whose discoverer has left no record. In every case we have the copy. We have never found the original. The maps survived. The sources that made them possible didn't. Piri Reis is the clearest example because he told us. He named his sources. He pointed back down the chain explicitly and gave us dates. The chain he pointed to ends in documents from the 4th century BCE that no longer exist. Those documents were themselves copies of something older. Piri Reis's own language implies a tradition of geographic knowledge that was already ancient when it passed through Alexandria, already centuries deep when Ptolemy described it in the 2nd century CE, already something inherited rather than original when Alexander's scholars first recorded it in the 4th century BCE. That tradition was already old when Alexander was alive. Whatever was at its beginning, whoever first produced the geographic knowledge that eventually entered the Alexandrian library and was copied and degraded and transmitted forward across millennia, was working in a world we have no other record of. And wherever that chain begins, whoever first made the maps that eventually, through copying and degradation and translation across languages and centuries, arrived as fragments on a piece of gazelle skin in Istanbul in 1513, we have never found them. We have never found any trace of them other than the accuracy inside the copies they left behind. The Portolan charts, the Haji Ahmed, the Zeno map, the Piri Reis, all of them carrying something forward from an origin we cannot see, all of them copies, none of them originals. The map is in the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul, in a controlled archive, not on public display. It is studied by scholars who have spent careers trying to determine what it shows and where the knowledge inside it came from. The debate continues. The source maps Piri Reis named are not in any archive. They are not in any collection. They are not anywhere. He pointed back down the chain. The chain ends in silence, and the silence is where the answer is, and we do not know how to reach it. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now, and make sure to subscribe.